said, well, at that particular time, they would have had to have irrigation for their crops. And certain crops, like the chickpea, for example, just simply wouldn't have been a winter crop. It would have been a summer crop and could only have been productive if it had been irrigated. And we find the earliest signs of a chickpea right down in the Dead Sea Valley, and also some up in the northern end of the Bekaa Valley, and within these fertile areas. And certainly the area of the Rift Valley where we got land at 1,200, 1,300 feet below sea level and water, clearly they were advantageous places for people to grow some of the more exotic type crops in those early times as the planet warmed up.
Yes.
And the growing of these crops also fits in with what we have of the climatic profile, which we can see that particular place would have been capable of growing crops according to both temperature and availability of water.
Can we mention something about the fact that when we look at this great water course, the causeway, we can potentially think that this must been a tremendous work to do this. And one connection with the Sitchin's work, if we were to do that in a way, would potentially be that could it be that they were trying to create workers who were willing to perform this very tedious task, so to speak?
I think that they were facing the problems that you and I would face if we had too much to do physical work, and worry that we weren't getting a job done fast enough, and worrying that we might be flooded if we didn't get the water course finished on time. Totally practical reasons. And then they use this in vitro fertilization, which we still have to wait 20 years to get a healthy young man to do the work. And so I don't see anything other than total common sense here. In the same way that we find the pharaohs in Egypt using artificial insemination with the young girls who came in once a month for the next batch, so to speak, to receive the semen from the pharaoh to produce a certain type of person at a certain time of the year, where they use the zodiac to create people rather than to forecast what people might be doing later on. It was a totally practical purpose, a eugenic purpose, but I don't want to get too far into that because that's, for some people, is much too much. But we have all sorts of parallels on this idea of in vitro fertilization, and it's something that in our hospitals, in our laboratories today, and with our farm animals, it's happening all the time.
Well, it is. You're right, and what we have to ask ourselves is, is this right? Is it not? I mean, again, the question that arises here is that if something so dramatic happened on the planet, and you're faced with this idea that either we can die here or we can survive, and so they decided, let's try to survive here instead. Excuse me. So what they potentially did then was that they began tampering with the genetics, and at that time they had the science, they had the knowledge on how to do this, and there's because there is this whole idea, if the planet is damaged, or hurt in some way, and things are potentially not working properly, then you potentially have to take these measures. You have to go this far, so to speak, in order to sustain yourself and sustain society. Correct?
That's right. I think that if you're a practical person and you've employed 50 people, as I did at one stage in my life, I found very quickly that I was only as good as the people who worked for me. And I only needed one or two people who were not performing, and that could lower the output for the whole team. And so you're only as good as the people who work for you. And for the people, I work for people too, and I was only as good as the people who employed me.
Yes.
So there was a mutual understanding between employee and employer that you have to be on the ball and get on with one another. The idea that you can create slaves isn't really a practical proposition. And what we see with the city-state system is we have this whole business of free will is emphasized from start to finish. The whole concept, for example, of the Druids, which is a modern experience of this ancient system, this high culture, is that the free will of man was the most single important issue.
Yes.
And this is the battle between the British Church at the time of Pelagius, who was the 20th abbot of Bangor-on-Dee, one of the ancient Druidic colleges and early monasteries of immense importance from the time of St. Paul's visit to the complete takeover by the Church of Rome in about 617, 620, when nearly 2,000 of the monks at Bangor-on-Dee were slaughtered in a battle with the Northumberland king. But Pelagius went in 396 to Rome to try and say to the Church of Rome, free will is our birthright. This is the most important thing for human beings, not to be enslaved in their minds or their bodies. It was considered to be the most important thing of all. And then this was the battle between free will and original sin. And there's several pieces on this on my website on the British Church section, which I think people will find very interesting. The way in which free will was considered so important, and how original sin was rejected in the East by the Christian Church. It was rejected by the British Christians, and it's been rejected by many other people. We also find our scientists now tell us that in terms of what's going on in this magical world of elements, an intelligent, responsive universe, that free will is essential and important there.
Yes.
And so we get all sorts of clues about the worst thing that can happen to human beings is to enslave their minds rather than their bodies. At least if their bodies are enslaved, they're physically fit probably, and it's in the interest of the enslaver to keep them healthy. But the worst thing that can happen to us is to have our minds enslaved, and that isn't in anybody's interest and never would have been, I don't believe.
Do you think that, the Romans were, how should I put it, spearheading that in a way then because of what consequently happened? You mentioned before that the Roman Empire, when they kind of set out and conquered and slaughtered consequently a lot of the Druids and the old system, do you think that a lot of this idea of free will were eradicated at that point?
See, the old order, the old high culture of the Druids was the communal ownership, common ownership of land. And what was important to every community, as it is to our community today, that we make the best use of every patch of land for that community. And this was an essential belief and requirement from the earliest of times. And therefore the king didn't own any land or property or possessions at all. He simply was a tenant of the gods. And his job was to make sure that land was fairly allocated to all the people within the community, and that everybody in the community was fairly treated. That's what kings used to do. Kings can't do that now. They haven't been able to do it since the church took over kingship, and from the time of the donation of Constantine in about 670. So the Roman track record here is very important. The Romans didn't believe in equality for women. They did not believe in communal ownership of land. They believed in the privatization of land. And they had a different philosophy altogether from the Druids, and regarded both the Druids and the Christians as mortal enemies. So in terms of those religious persecutions which we see, the key targets for that religious persecution were the Druids and the early Christians. And Jesus, of course, would have been taught in a Druidic academy or something similar, and he certainly sent his second son to a Druidic academy in southern France. But that's another story.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I want to ask you... sorry, go ahead.
Now, this particular... you've asked an extremely important question, which we could spend a lot of time discussing.
Yes.
And I hope people will go to my website and see that the Druids have been given a very bad press, and it's totally unjustifiable. But the kind of high culture we had in Britain was a survival of the Golden Age, and that the concept of Christianity adopted by the early British people, including Constantine, was what we call Arian Christian, which was the closest thing we get to what Jesus was teaching, and also what was taught in the Oriental and the Druidic colleges and schools of the time, which centered on free will, centered on equality of women, centered on the old Golden Age order. And this is why we find Jesus and Muhammad much later making it quite clear that they did not want a new religion. They wanted to go back to the Golden Age, the Abrahamic faith, as they called it.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have an extraordinary turning point in history where both Jesus and much later Muhammad said, hey, enough is enough. We want to get back to the old ways, the old golden age. And the philosophers of Alexandria will support this, and many others. Seneca, who advised Nero, for example, was a strong believer that there was a golden age and that everything had fallen apart when that golden age broke down, which was the collapse of the great Bronze Age civilization around about 2354.
Fascinating. And as I say, this is a whole subject in itself. So leaving that aside for now, for this time at least, I want to spend here the last 10 minutes or so talking a little bit about what we potentially could be, facing in the future years, the potential threat. We've been talking about catastrophe, and I guess we can start off with a point, or with the idea that this is potentially something that occurs in cycles. This is a repetitive thing. This is something that is returning now and then to the planet for whatever reason, of course. That's very interesting in itself. But what do you think, Edmund, about this? And do you think or believe that we are facing another potential catastrophe at this time?
My source information, the man who got me really interested in this subject, was called Professor Victor Klube, who was our leading astrophysicist in this country, based at Oxford. And he was a very open, broad-minded man who was involved in the writing of 2 books with somebody called Bill Napier, who is also one of the great astronomers from Armagh in Northern Ireland. And they wrote 2 books called The Cosmic Serpent and The Cosmic Winter. These 2 books not only gave us some fantastic information about history, telling us about the Encyclopedia of Astronomy amongst the Sumerians, which was called Enuma, Anu and Enel, and in the beginning, Enel. And within their work, they identified cycles, regular rhythms and cycles. They preferred to call them episodic, of cometary debris problems which had been around a long while, which kept coming back on a cyclical basis. And Victor Klube's conclusions towards the end of his career was that there was he called a centennial risk, 100-year risk of something like the Tunguska explosion, which if it happened today, over Belgium, for example, it would kill everybody in Belgium. Now, the world is very much more heavily populated than in the past. So a repeat of that centennial risk, just under normal conditions, would be a major problem. But what he's saying is that, and I end my first lecture, Learning from History Part 1, with the comments that Victor Klube makes about catastrophism, to say that we are now entering a phase, a cyclical phase, one of these regular rhythms, where we have a much higher risk even than that centennial 100-year risk. And therefore we must take the past and what happened in the past extremely seriously. And this is why I believe we find Bill Gates putting a tremendous amount of money into the Norwegian government's program to put a seed bank and do all the things that the Anunnaki did 10,000 years ago or so. It's being done again today for exactly the same reasons. But no government, nobody in government is going to talk about the risks and these kind of problems because it would cause alarm and concern to the public. And I don't want to cause alarm and concern to the public. I just want to say, just look at all the possibilities and think that we need much more common sense about the way we plan our housing, have our water supplies, use our local energy, local food, and don't rely on massive lines of communication. Most people know that wars were lost in the past by people whose communication lines got too long. And so there's a big lesson there about bringing food from all over the world to Britain, which is now virtually dependent on half its food to come from abroad, which is complete and utter nonsense. With a very large part, 50% of the British Isles, the uplands and hills of the British Isles, which have created wonderful environments for wildlife and for people to work and enjoy, are being shut down through totally